Hi, welcome to our TOK presentation. I'm Adrian Vasquez.
I'm Sean Mendiola.
And I'm Galen Hastings.
All right. So, for our presentation, the RLS that we used is the proliferation of media spreading misinformation about electronic cigarettes. And so in order to really discuss this idea, we're kind of actually going to need to start from the current day and then kind of work backwards a bit. So the current situation as of November 7th is that there were 2,051 injuries and 39 deaths, which were attributed to vaping. But when I say attributed to vaping, what exactly do I mean? And up until now, this exact reason, the exact cause of all of these was not very well understood. All we knew is that there was a correlation between those who used vaping devices and those who maintained the injuries and deaths. However, very recently, the CDC discovered that in almost every single case, there was a presence of vitamin E acetate found within their lungs. And this vitamin E acetate is a very important part because what it actually proves is it is a signifier that all of the cartridges were used were THC specifically. And we know this because the vitamin E acetate is a thickening agent which is used in black market THC carts in order to dilute them and in order to increase profit margins. And if this seems unfounded, even the FDA themselves warned against this, and they said specifically, talked about THC, tetrahydrocannabinol vaping products on the street or the black market, which were the main health risk and health warning. So if even the FDA has discussed this, we need to realize that there was also quite a bit of extraneous information that was surrounding this. So for example, first, the New York Times. They wrote an article, What You Need to Know About Vaping-Related Lung Illnesses. Who is at risk? And they wrote that anyone who uses electronic cigarettes or other vaping devices is at risk. Furthermore, an article written in the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel talked about how a health organization cited alarming statistics about e-cigarette use among young people. State health department issued an advisory aimed at curbing this trend. It is labeling an epidemic. And furthermore, very recently, Alex Azar, the Human Services Secretary of the United States, released that the Trump administration is making it clear that we intend to clear the market of flavored e-cigarettes to reverse the deeply concerning epidemic of youth e-cigarette use that is impacting children, families, schools, and communities. Now, these three articles are just a small sampling of the many articles that have been written recently about e-cigarettes and their correlative response to vaping illnesses. And the issue that this creates is that there is a widespread panic and a widespread proliferation of this media which is directly targeting the e-cigarettes, which have actually been the object which has not been causing them. Now, while it is understood that we do not understand the health effects of electronic cigarettes, the issue that this creates is that it allows the proliferation of black market electronic cigarettes, which will cause even more damage than the ones that are already currently out there. So, for example, after the flavored Juul pods were banned, many fake Juul pods actually began to be sold in stores as a replacement for them. Furthermore, big tobacco, or after this whole ban of flavored electronic cigarettes, specifically with Juul, after this happened, the company Altria, which owns Philip Morris USA, which is the largest tobacco manufacturer in the world, installed their own executive as the CEO of Juul and outed the current CEO of Juul. So this this massive panic has already been used by the largest tobacco companies in the world to leverage themselves into the market again. So people who originally were able to get themselves off of cigarettes and began to use electronic cigarettes instead are now forced to go back to cigarettes themselves, which are known to have about 7,000 more compounds in them, which are known to have health defects. Further examples of this misinformation, which has recently been kind of nullified, is there was a study that linked vaping to heart attacks. However, recently there was a massive pushback, especially between the two main tobacco researchers who conducted that experiment and found that a lot of the information that they used was erroneous. Furthermore, a recent article, which was medically reviewed by a PhD, found that nicotine actually does not cause cancer. It was actually the carcinogens which were found in the tobacco which was combusted, which caused cancer. So throughout all of this, throughout all of these misconceptions and all of these different ideas that are being put out, the misconceptions about it still pervade. So 53% of the public was polled, and they disagreed with the statement, e-cigarettes are less harmful than traditional cigarettes. And 49% of the public was polled, and they believed that all e-cigarettes should be banned. And despite the fact that the FDA and many of these news sites have started to push back against this, these misconceptions, they still exist. So what this leads us to wonder is, to what extent does the spread of knowledge determine its significance? Since even though there was a large spread of this knowledge which was incorrect, its significance was still very strong, which led to the Trump administration beginning to take legislation on this. In order to answer this knowledge question, first, Sean has his own claim.
So with our claim 1, we must realize that the spread of knowledge heavily influences its significance. Some smoking propaganda that I'm going to be uncovering today will help explain the TOK. And to begin, in 1913, Camel became the first mass-produced company to create cigarettes, which gave birth to the modern cigarette as we know today. Because in 1913 and until 1930, smoking cigarettes was morale boosting, especially during World War I, because it helped soldiers. Morale boosting, which helped soldiers relieve their stresses. It became popular among the average person, became socially acceptable, and cigarettes became cheap and legal at the time. And then in the 50s, in the UK, about 60% of the population was hooked on smoking, which created a positive influence around smoking cigarettes, because celebrities such as Audrey Hepburn or James Dean, who were icons at the time, were smoking cigarettes too, which helped advertise cigarettes like Camel and Marlboro and spread awareness around smoking cigarettes, making you a cool, ideal person. Before, expensive cigars were exclusive, so cigarettes was a more affordable and accessible alternative to those cigars. However, in 1951, there were health concerns. So there was tests to find research that smoking was related to the rise in lung cancer and smoking cough from this health concern. So cigarette companies responded to cover up the fact that smokers were inhaling tar, carcinogens, and smoke, which generally had a lot of chemicals in them. And in the 1960s, there was a shift in attitude after the response to these health concerns. There's a decrease in consumption due to the stigma around smoking cigarettes, because people began to believe that cigarette smoking was for impoverished people who were not educated and had a higher mental health, scored higher on the mental health concern index. And another shift in attitude also led to a lot of youth, teenagers smoking in the 1970s, around that period. So with this background information, one should use the area of knowledge of art to respond to the claim of smoking propaganda in art and expose the concerns of the spread of knowledge. So what is art for, and what criteria defines art in terms of propaganda? You must explore the nature of its art and its value of significance with three elements: the intention of art, the quality of work, and the response to the audience. So to begin with intention, the intention of art through propaganda is supposed to create an aesthetic response, an idea of beauty of art, to deliberately communicate the intentions of the artist and the art through propaganda. At this time, with the camel, smoking propaganda, like I said earlier, was supposed to boost morale, especially after World War I and World War II, which creates a positive influence on propaganda with the boost of morale. You have suave-looking characters, here with the camel related to the camel cigarettes, to induce feelings of high self-esteem, and having pride in oneself, which the artist made it obvious to the audience that with the camel and having him in a tuxedo, which made it show that someone could feel important, just like the icon, like James Dean, once they smoke cigarettes. Next, talking about the quality of work. The quality of work in terms of art is supposed to be the perfect combination of form and content. In this case, with Salem, the propaganda is clearly depicting intent through the image. Here you see that this propaganda poster here has writing to endorse satisfaction and the idea of a happier lifestyle in forms of form and content. You have these two people, perhaps a couple, walking through the forest and going through the trees, which may evoke a sense of serenity and peacefulness with the cool colors as they walk through the woods. And some ideas you might get with this poster, maybe a lifestyle of leisurely activity, or a breath of fresh air, which is what cigarettes at the time were advertising themselves as. One of the quotes was, "Smoking cigarettes was a fresh of mountain air." In this case, with content and form, it's supposed to evoke the idea of that new breath of life and leisure. And next, in the third element of what defines art, is who is the audience that they're reaching out to, which is one of the key aspects. In terms of audience and taste, there's a Latin phrase called de gustibus non disputandum est, or in translation, or in matters of taste, there is no dispute. So the audience that cigarette companies were using with their propaganda to grab their attention was focused mainly on adult men and women around the age of 30 until their later adult years during the 1950s and 60s. And with that said, because of the post-war effects, Americans and adults had a deeper sense of pride in their country, as I mentioned before. And they started smoking, and propaganda was tailored towards these two demographics because of the soldiers who brought back their habits from the war, which was at the time the perfect time for cigarette companies to advertise their cigarettes because of the high morale and the rise in cigarette smoking as well. So here in this case, propaganda is supposed to influence knowledge of a positive message. Here it says where a man belongs, and there's a little even every woman. So you have this sense of satisfaction from smoking. And since taste cannot be disputed, coming from the audience's perspective. All the propaganda was trying to do was pinpoint out which type of demographic they were looking for in order for them to get the highest amount of numbers through attention. So with this said, after defining what art is and the 3 criteria of how you can define art, you must also look at how art influences knowledge of the world through propaganda rather than solely just defining what art is. So in this case, what form of knowledge does smoking propaganda influence positivity, since big tobacco companies are looking to sell their products? I'm going to be talking about the health concerns mentioned before, and I'm going to explain how art reflects knowledge, how art communicates knowledge, and how art educates the audience. Here we have the idea of art reflecting knowledge through imitation. So as I mentioned earlier, big tobacco companies responded to the health concerns of inhaling tar and developing lung cancer by putting on physicians and dentists on their posters to create the sense of trust and certainty with filtering their cigarettes, which was supposed to get rid of all of the unhealthy chemicals after you smoke. In this poster, they say that Luckies are less irritating because it's toasted, which was another form of, in a sense, misinformation, that toasting cigarettes would somewhat make it healthier on your lungs, less irritating on your throat. However, as I mentioned, that this was solely just to cover up to get their advertisement and to sell their products to their demographic. And apparently, according to these posters, it's supposed to show that medical research was properly done to test that filtering cigarettes got rid of the chemicals and the smoke carcinogens. And then, in forms of communication, what is the art communicating? In this case, smoking and the idea of smoking with having the doctors shows that smoking is healthy and acceptable, which was also a cover-up. And if your dentist is saying that he would recommend Viceroy's, then one would assume that you should trust that smoking in general is okay. With that said, the spread of this knowledge influenced the rise in smoking because of how acceptable it was at the time. And then something important in forms of communication, these posters and these propagandas would have quotes and lab tests and having numbers there to emphasize the power of words through communication, and to make it obvious that smoking was allowed and accepted. And the third point of how art is explaining knowledge, you have to question, how is art educating the audience? So in this case, since there was the rise in smoking in adults, kids began smoking as well. The fact that the knowledge was spread about smoking, they would be failed to mention that kids weren't tested. It was actually just adults, and kids failed to realize that. So with that, there's a fail in education through art because formal testing procedures only acted on adult tests and not teenagers. So teenagers thought that this was evidence that smoking was okay, or even inhaling smoke in general was fine to do. And propaganda was tailored for everyone to smoke. However, these kids would come up with the idea that if they wanted to be cool or ideal, just like the celebrities and icons, that they had to smoke, just like the soldiers as well. Which brings up a big point called the paradox of fiction, in which teenagers wanted to be an ideal person within society, so they got evidence that was not concrete and used their imagination to believe that soldiers or the icon who were smoking would lead to them smoking, which in a sense would be true. So they trusted in the propaganda to ignite curiosity, and they had a false sense of truth.
Yeah, that does lead into our next example, which is social Darwinism, speaking in the context of the United States. What social Darwinism really is at its core is sort of a misinterpreted and bastardized version of Darwinism. Darwinism talks about evolution through species or beings being fit for their environment, and if they're fit for their environment, they will pass on their genes and be allowed to reproduce, and those with unfit genes will die off and their bloodline will be cut off, and those with favorable genes their genes will continue to be perpetuated. However, this is a theory exclusively grounded in biology, but many sociologists took this idea of Darwinism and applied it to sociology and applied it to human relationships, saying there's a natural hierarchy of human beings as well as species. Keep in mind, this is not factual at all. This is not at all what Darwin was saying. This is completely made up, yet it was a theory that kept being passed on and affected American society in many impactful ways, such as how we approach economics and capitalism. Many social Darwinist capitalists advocated that we shouldn't have any sort of welfare systems for those who are lower class or poor, because it was actually they were inherently inferior, and their genetics kind of made them to be poor, and they have genetic traits such as like idleness, alcoholism, laziness, stupidity, all those sort of things. And so giving them welfare programs would allow them to keep reproducing and tainting the gene pool. And so up until the 1970s, there was very little support for the poor, and this social Darwinist philosophy kept being perpetuated. Furthermore, social Darwinism found its way into military expeditions of the United States. Social Darwinism sort of acted as a justification for the invasion and conquering of the Philippines, Cuba, and Puerto Rico, them saying that us, the superior Americans, need to bring civilization to the quote-unquote backwards people, inherently backwards. And so this spread of misinformation and how much impact it's had on American society further exemplifies how much the spread of an idea has influences how impactful that knowledge is in a greater context. Furthermore, we can tie this back to the KQ of how we have the theory of evolution, something completely grounded in biology, a natural science, and they took this theory and jumped it to human sciences. It's sort of an unnatural jump, and they sort of skipped the logic and the area of knowledge of biology, the human sciences. And in the same way that the vaping crisis, all the deaths and the hysteria led to many people advocating for a complete ban of vaping, yet they skipped over a valuable AOK of the natural sciences and figure out what the root cause of this. And what they should have done is gone to what the actual natural cause of the deaths were before any sort of legislation was made. So both of these examples had a sort of unjust logical jump, and they both skipped over a critical area of knowledge that they needed to further examine. But that leads into our second counterclaim.
That the spread of knowledge has little influence on its significance. So the example that we're going to use to examine this counterclaim is pseudoscience, specifically astrology. So this is in the area of knowledge of the natural sciences. And so what is pseudoscience defined as? So a pseudoscience is a body of work that claims that it has the status of a science while lacking the substance to back it up. And this happens because one cannot simply state that their claims are scientific. They must prove that they're scientific via the scientific method. And the main differences between science and pseudoscience is that pseudoscience usually has vagueness and ad hoc exceptions. Ad hoc exceptions are when you create a rule, and if someone else were to point out an example of a time when that rule is not followed, an adjustment to that rule would be made. So, for example, if you say all swans are white, and then someone shows you a black swan, you would say all swans are white except for that one. And that is a telltale sign of pseudosciences. So why are we asking this? So the point is that astrology, while being able to be defined as a pseudoscience, has quite a large reach. About 73% of British adults believe in astrology, and this is a much, so 73% of British adults believe in astrology, and even though this number of people who believe this, although the spread is large, there's been no legislation or anything that has been taken on it, so its significance is still very low, despite the fact that it actually has a larger spread of knowledge base than the ideas about electronic cigarettes and everything. And so we need to ask, how come this does not follow the pattern that we were discussing about the spread of knowledge having significance on it? So how come this spread of knowledge does not have a impact on its significance? And one thing that we can come up to is that astrology, while being largely accepted by the populace, does not really fit into the body, the large corpus of knowledge that exists within science itself. And so, since it does not follow since it does not conform to the ideas of the shared population of the scientific community, or of the legislative community as well, it does not have that much of an influence, because it doesn't follow the beliefs of those who have the power to change things. And so from this we can arrive at our conclusion. Yep.
So our conclusion is that the spread of knowledge affects its significance to the extent or as long as it conforms to the shared knowledge of a population. And so what we mean by this is that there is common knowledge that counteracts much of the spread of misinformation. So if we take smoking, back in the day, it wasn't commonly known that cigarettes were very highly correlated with lung cancer and all these other ill effects. But now that we do know that, much of the smoking campaigns would be ineffective, since we already have that shared knowledge. And plus, it's also counteracted by much of the advertisements, such as Truth or Fresh Empire, that go on today, that are very much against tobacco consumption, especially youth tobacco consumption. Social Darwinism thrived mostly because there was very little knowledge about Darwinism itself. It wasn't common knowledge that Darwinism was a theory exclusively grounded in biology, and so Darwinism was allowed to thrive in a sociology context because of that lack of knowledge that it's exclusively grounded in biology. And we take astrology, for example, that didn't thrive because we already have a faith in scientific institutions, and we already have faith in the scientific method, and that counteracts how significant astrology becomes. And so to relate this back to the KQ, it would not be just to completely outright ban vaping, because we can see that it was mostly attributed to the fake THC cards. However, things like laws that are in San Francisco, where we are allowing e-cigarettes, as long as they are approved by the FDA, is an appropriate measure because it takes the safety considerations in mind, while it doesn't jump the gun and say that all vaping is bad and all of it has vitamin E and all of it will kill you.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Thank you.
Just talking about we're excited. All right.